Hey everybody, and welcome to FIST. Pastor, have you seen this? Yeah, P-H-Y-S-T. Yeah, it's an unfortunate acronym because we're just really friendly around here. We don't want to fight anybody. No, it's none of that going on. There's just this is a warm interplay of ideas where you send us internet content and we comment. And then you get to know a little bit about what maybe a Christian pastor might say about some of the internet content that you see as you're scrolling, you're doom scrolling, and you're going, wow, that's an interesting take on the Bible or on Christianity or on morals or on the nation or whatever. And so we're happy to comment on that and hopefully enlighten and help make the Christian worldview make sense. If you have something you'd like us to comment on, send it to this address right here, social@ac3.org, and we will be happy to comment on it. And so now let's comment on the thing that someone sent us here. And it is titled, "What does God have against mixing linen and wool?" Does God have a problem?
Why in the world would there be a commandment in the Bible that specifically
She's got a
says,
really big Bible.
do not wear fabrics mixed with linen and wool? Don't mix those two. Why would there be a commandment like that in the Bible?
I don't know if she's going to answer it, but let me just pause here and say that there is an answer to this question. So on the one hand, it points to the idea that many of the laws in the Old Testament do not have any ethical content. This is really important to say. So the ethical content of a law about mixing fabrics is only as it relates to the fact that God gave the commandment. And to disobey what God says, the source of all goodness, to disobey God is intrinsically, inherently evil. Why? Because God might give a commandment like, don't step over that log. And you say, what's the ethical content? It's a log and I'm stepping. What is there that's good, bad, or different about walking on a log? But what if there's a cliff on the other side of the log? And then the ethical content may be secondary or incidental to the specifics of the command. And so, friends, you must understand this. If you want to understand the Bible and the entire biblical worldview, first of all, you got to read the whole thing in context. It's a story, right? And if you read it as just a bunch of do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this, then it's become for you a code, a rule book, and it was never, ever, ever meant to be a rule book. So what do these rules have to say about the larger context of the story that's being told? Okay, so the larger story that's being told is that God has rescued his people out of slavery. And they are there godless in some sense, religionless. Yes, they have the God of their forefathers 450 years ago, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they've largely forgotten. And God needs to reintroduce himself to his own people that were selected through the forefathers. And so when he does so, he gives them, first of all, salvation. Let's make this really, really clear. The first thing he gives them is grace. The first thing he gives them is rescue. He rescues them from the land of slavery in great acts of power and deliverance. Okay? So we won't get into that piece. But then he gives them a law. They go to the Mount Sinai, and then they get the law. And they get the 10 Commandments, notably the big ethical Big Ten. And these commandments, unlike the commands that she's talking about here, are intrinsically ethical in a primary way and not in a secondary or incidental way. Their content is itself intrinsically ethical, or that is to say moral, transcendently moral, founded in the absolute good, just, true, loving character of God. Things like do not murder, do not steal, do not lie, do not covet. Okay, those sorts of things. But then we have these laws attached to the whole panoply of Mosaic law. What gives? Great question. But listen, as the people of Israel are coming out of slavery and then they're going to go into their own land, they're going to dispossess nations. And those nations have their own gods. Notably, the detestable gods of the Canaanites, Baal, and the detestable god Molech, who required child sacrifice and ritualistic sex and all sorts of just unbelievably destructive behaviors. And So when they go into that land, God knows that the surrounding worldviews around his own people will be a constant temptation to them. And so his commands to them are to come out from among them and be separate. That is a sort of overarching commandment under which you can file a lot of these ceremonial commands that are distinct from the moral commands. The ceremonial commands, as I said, don't seem to have any ethical content in them, but they have a teaching effect. So among these, we might consider the food laws, then also these clothing laws. What's going on when God says, don't mix two different kinds of fabric in your clothing? Well, he's talking about not mixing, and he says this in a bunch of different laws. Don't mix. I don't want you to mix. And so there's a teaching commandment about the purity God requires in his people. He wants his people to be single-minded in their devotion to him. He wants them to be unpolluted by the ideas and the thought patterns of carnal and depraved systems that are driven by forces of darkness. Don't mix with them. And he says this over and over and over again. So when the Israelites would put on their clothing, okay, clothing unmixed, right? So it's all one thing or it's all another, right? This would remind them, oh, that's right. I am single-mindedly to be devoted to Yahweh, my King. I am to be single-minded in my devotion to God. And so similarly with the food laws. So some people think the food laws were all about protecting God's people from the potential negative health effects of eating carrion and predators and certain kinds of scavengers. Yep. And I think that there might be something about that. But then I don't know that God would have given that command to his people without them understanding why he gave it at all. Because, of course, they wouldn't understand that the development of bacteria, right? Or they wouldn't understand that bacteria was a major cause of the transmission of disease 3,000 years after they had been told by God to wash constantly. They're constantly told to wash. We can see a protecting influence in there, but there had to be something they understood in their context. And I think in all of these kinds of laws that don't seem to have an overt ethical content in them, there is a teaching effect that God is trying to convey to his people. And with the food laws, the animals that they're forbidden to eat seem to be a mix. That's a fascinating thing. So if it was an animal that has split hoof and chewed the cud, then they could eat it. But if it had only one or the other, therefore it was a mix, they couldn't eat it. If it was an animal that seemed to be of the water, but also of the soil, like, for example, the bottom-feeding fish, like crayfish and crab and lobster and all that kind of stuff, they couldn't eat it because it was a mix. You see, it was a mix of the water and the land, but they could eat anything that had scales and gills. So because those animals were unmixed. You see, they were just of the water. Similarly with vultures. Vultures it was deemed that they were not just creatures of the sky, but because they ate flesh, that you could see them tearing apart carrion and all that kind of stuff. Roadkill. Roadkill. They didn't have roads back then. Well, they did, but you know what I mean. So seeing that, those animals represented, again, mixture. Okay, so again, the point being that God wanted them to be unmixed. So is there value in these laws? Yes, but the value is instrumental. The value is in a secondary teaching effect, not in a primary ethical effect. And that is why the same God who gives these laws, and it is immoral for the Jews to disobey those laws, those exact same laws could be lifted in the New Testament period with no violence to our ethical framework. And you say, well, does that mean our ethical framework is constantly shifting in its moral relativity? No, because the Ten Commandments, for example, as I said, they do have ongoing ethical force in the life of the follower of Jesus, who is nevertheless released from the ceremonial aspects of the law, which are no longer in in force in the life of the believer. Why not? Because as the writer of Hebrews says, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1, because these things are shadows of the good things to come. So in what way were they shadows? They hinted at things, right? They hinted, as I said, at the need to be unmixed or pure in devotion, or for example, the entire sacrificial system, which is that whole suite of laws is gone. So it seems like this is so controversial for people. Why can the Jews not eat crayfish or shellfish, but Christians can? Is God, did God move the goalposts or whatever? Listen, I mean, when we make those arguments, it's like we've forgotten that the lion's share of the rules for Jews under the Mosaic system are suspended for Christians since the sacrifice of Christ, because they revolved around sacrifices. And it's like no one brings that up. Like when you bring up shellfish, why don't you bring up sacrificing your lambs? No one brought lambs to church last Sunday. That entire set of regulations is gone and no longer enforced for the follower of Jesus Christ, because the intent of them has been fulfilled in the coming of the Lamb of God in Jesus Christ. What was the point of them then? Why did God even require it? Why was it unethical for them to disobey those rules? Because they were put in place to teach us about our human need, human sinfulness, God's holiness, the need for grace, the need for substitution, the incredible cost of sin, that sin requires cost, and that cost must be paid. These are the things that are not necessarily maybe self-evident to the human person, but needed to be taught for literally centuries up until the coming of the time of Christ, at which time those rules, those ceremonial requirements and regulations were suspended while the moral framework of the Mosaic Law remains in force all the way up to the present. And if you wanted to simplify the Mosaic moral demands, they are summarized by Jesus even simpler than 10 down to 1. And anyone want to guess? Anyone want to guess what the 1 is? Love your neighbor as yourself, because as Paul says, Romans chapter 13, love does no harm to its neighbor. So all the ethical demands of the law that carry forward can be summarized in one law. And so this person goes on for 7 minutes, and I've gone on too long. So we might parse this video a little bit more later, but I think just this one question is very, very important for us to have, how we should frame some of these Old Testament laws that trip us up. We have to put it in where does it fit in the story? And in the story, God is teaching his people certain incredibly important concepts. And then at some point, some of the ceremonial regulations that God had in force, he will lift, because they are replaced by the real, the shadows replaced by the reality itself, which is summarized in Jesus the Christ. All right, enough said about that. So we'll see you next time here on Pastor, Have You Seen This?